I invite you to open up your Bibles to Mark chapter 7, and we'll be looking there in just a moment. Mark chapter 7. It is good to see each one here, so many here to worship together and to focus our attention on God. We'll be talking a little bit about that idea of making sure that we are keenly focused on Him and maybe take away our focus some from the world that is around us. I want to talk on the subject of being offended and being offensive. And as we think about that in our current culture, in our nation, we are a nation of snowflakes. And we are a nation of people with flamethrowers who delight in melting snowflakes. And the great irony is that the people holding the flamethrowers are snowflakes themselves. Now, if you don't know what that term means, snowflake, that's somebody who is very easily offended and melts when words that they don't like are said and go running for safe places so that they don't have to hear those words anymore. And of course, the flamethrower would be the person who delights in saying those words that set people off, that trigger people. As Christians, where do we fit in that sort of flame war that's going on round about us? I think that as Christians, we ought to be the hardest people in the world to offend and the least likely to give offense, at least in some ways. And so I want to think about that, think about what God's Word says to us on that subject, and particularly as was suggested by Stan in the songs that he led, Jesus as the example of where we should be on that. In the category of receiving offense, there are just any number of ways and reasons that we receive offense, that we are offended. In the first place, we are offended because we think something's happened, even if it hasn't happened, right? There's a perception. And so this happens in every relationship, from marriage relationships where we perceive that someone was upset with us, and that's not really the case at all. But we begin, once we introduce that perception, boy, we can really build on that. And we can really just make a very strong case about how horrible this other person is based on complete fiction, complete imagination. That happens a lot. I don't know about you, but I've been on both ends of that. I've been on the imagining end and the one who has been imagined against. And so we have to be careful about that. There is something that may be actually offensive, but it's not intentional. This is not just that we imagined. Maybe somebody did say something hurtful, but the reason they said it is because they had no idea that it would be hurtful to you. And so there again, we can imagine. We can build off, okay, this is actually hurtful, but then we can build off, they knew that would be hurtful, and they said it just to get up under my skin. And so again, we're introducing the imagination. Sometimes there's offenses, and we're certain of the offense, and maybe we even feel quite confident that they mean to have offended us, but there's no way to prove it. And this is a struggle. This is a frustration. In other words, we feel pretty strongly about that, but if we were to take that case to 2 or 3 witnesses, we were to take that case before a brother or sister in Christ, they might say, look, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not convinced. I'm not sure that that's what's going on there. That's difficult to deal with. And then there is just the clearly intentional offense that somebody does mean, and that does happen. That sometimes there are people who do things in order to hurt you. They say it in order to hurt you. And you might even say, why would you say that? And they might say, because I want to hurt you. I've been on both ends of that, sadly. So, lots of categories for offense. And I think that we need to think through how to deal with each of those categories of offense. And there's some bleed over, right? But then there's going to be some universal principles that apply to all of them. So let's just think through some of those principles on receiving offense. In the first place, do not bear false witness. This will help us in not receiving more offense than is necessary. And when I say do not bear false witness, I mean don't make things up. Don't make things up from the standpoint of bearing false witness to someone else, but also don't make it up in your own mind. In other words, sometimes I think slander certainly involves the telling of something to someone else. That is slander. But slander can happen just right up here. I mean, we can just go through the slander with ourselves and just really create quite the narrative when the facts do not support that. And in fact, maybe when a single conversation might have set the whole thing to rest. Over in Mark chapter 7 and in verse 22, there's 3 passages here. I just want to note some of the things that are coupled together with slander. He says, beginning in verse 21, for from within, out of the heart of men proceed evil thoughts, fornication, thefts, murders, adulteries. But particularly in verse 22, the list there continues, deeds of coveting and wickedness, as well as deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, and foolishness. I don't think that every list of sins, that all the sins have to be connected, but I really think there's some connections here. That when you look at slander, so very often there's some sort of ill will already there. There's some envy already there. There's some pride on my part already there. There's certainly foolishness. And then there's some deceit, whether it's of others or, again, of myself. Over in Colossians chapter 3, there and in verse 8, Colossians 3 and in verse 8, he says, but now you also put them all aside, anger and wrath and malice and slander and abusive speech to your mouth. Do not lie to one another. Now, a lot of times we put that lie into the generic category, but notice right here, it specifically, it follows in the line of the notion of lying about others and being abusive towards others in your speech. Over in 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 1, in 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 1, it says, therefore, putting aside all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. I think that this is a part of it. Hypocrisy in that if we said or did the same thing very often, if we would just think about that, we would certainly not want people to assign motives to us. We wouldn't want them to make things up about us. We would want them to give us the benefit of the doubt, which goes right along with this idea of not bearing false witness, is to give that benefit of the doubt. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, that passage that we know so well that describes in great detail the character, the mindset of love, he concludes a number of character aspects of love by saying it bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. That idea of believes all things, one of the commentators put it this way, believes what is credibly possible to believe. I want to believe the best. I want to hope the best of my neighbor, of the stranger even. I was reading an article a while back, and I was impressed with the article. It was a man living in Minnesota, black man living in Minnesota in the same city where George Floyd was killed. And he was struggling with the emotions of that, and he took his family out for a walk, and he said as he was going on a walk that there was a little old white lady, and she crossed the road as he came near. And he said, now, I have some options. I can choose to assume that she did that because I'm black. And right now, if I tweeted that out, I'd get lots of people sympathizing with me and saying, yes, it's the terrible country we live on and so forth. He said, but let me just suggest any number of reasons why she might have crossed the street that are much more benign than that. And he went down through them. And he said, now, maybe that little old lady was a hardened racist. And certainly they do exist. But God didn't allow me to see that that was the case with this woman. I don't know. And so I'm not going to go down the path of bitterness, making things up, bearing false witness, going out on social media and ripping this woman who I do not know her intentions, but assuming I do, taking the role of God and of Jesus. And it's not just with race, certainly. With every interaction, we have so many choices. When we go through the checkout line and the lady is brusque or rude, we can make assumptions that it's me personally. Or we could say, that lady must not be having a very good day. And we could give the benefit of the doubt, the same benefit of the doubt that we want given to ourselves. We can choose, especially in the case where there is no evidence, whether or not to make that offensive or not. And God's word, the weight of it all leans in the direction of do not make offensive what does not have to be. None of that says that those offensive possibilities are not possible. It is to say, don't default there. Don't start there. But that our starting point should be, believes all things. Is it credibly possible to believe better? Well, then do so. Well, what if there is some evidence? And now we have a little bit more certainty that an offense has occurred. Maybe it is an offense that rises to the point that we need to make our case. Jesus gives us a pattern. He says, here's how to approach that. If it is between you and that person, go to that person. Go to that person. Strive to bring them towards you, to win them back, and to put to rest the offense. Don't nurse it. Don't hold on to it and delight in it, but rather strive to remove the offense. And then he says, if that does not work, well, then take along 2 or 3 witnesses, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every word may be established. And then if it is established at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses and he still will not listen, well, then take it before the congregation. And maybe the offense is such that that is the process you need to go through. Let me suggest, not every time you're offended does that need to be the process. Sometimes we do need to take the offense. Sometimes we need to recognize that maybe the sensitivity is all on our part and that they are not the guilty party. Maybe we are. And I think that is part of the reason for this process, that you do take along those 2 or 3 witnesses. Because maybe when you have 2 or 3 trusted brothers or sisters in Christ and you sit down and you begin to work through that, they help you realize this is not as big of a deal as you think it is. And so maybe you need to set it down. And I think that is illustrated over in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. In 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 5, where he's going through their disagreements that have gone over into the courts of law. And he says, I say this to your shame in verse 5. Is it so that there is not among you one wise man who will be able to decide between his brethren? But brother goes to law with brother, and that before unbelievers. Actually, then, it is already a defeat for you, that you have lawsuits with one another. Why not rather be wronged? Why not rather be defrauded? I think sometimes people don't want to take their issues before other brethren because they're afraid other brethren might not agree with them. Maybe that's right. Maybe that says something to you. If taking 2 or 3 witnesses, you say, well, I don't know if I can find 2 or 3 witnesses to be on the same page with me. Yeah, that's kind of the point. Maybe then you should drop it. And so you take those 2 or 3 witnesses and it's not satisfying and you walk away and you're still the only one who thinks that something wrong has occurred. Take that. Just take the offense. Whatever wrong you think you've suffered, go on and live your life without bitterness. And don't hold on to that anymore. Set it down is the idea. Well, what then when it is clear to everyone that the offense is intentional? That there is a desire to hurt, to cause pain, well, take it. Take it even then. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39, Jesus, contrasting their view of eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, says cheek for a cheek, but not the way you think. He slaps one, you offer the other. I've had conversations sometimes with people where we're talking about that kind of thing, about insults, and they'll actually say something. What do you just expect me to take it? I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but yes. That's literally what he's saying here. Take the insult. Receive it. Not only receive it, but receive it gladly. Again, in Acts chapter 5, the beatings of the apostles, they go out rejoicing that they had been able to suffer for the cause of Christ. And so we don't just receive it grumbling. We don't just receive it with clenched jaw, hatred fuming beneath the surface, but rather with an offer. Do you need to get something else off your chest? Is there some other insult that you need to go ahead and offer? I will receive it. What would that do? What would that change in those interactions? I don't know if it'll change the other person. It's got potential to. I guarantee you it'll change us. And that's who Jesus is concerned about. In Romans chapter 12, of course, there's a great deal of instruction in that chapter about how to deal with enemies. In particular, Romans chapter 12 and verse 20, but if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And the idea of enemies, there are declared enemies, official enemies, people who we are actually hostile with. And then, I think, more importantly for application, there are the people who are momentary enemies. Like we have momentary enemies in our own houses, don't we? Like we become enemies for a little while. Not like now we've declared that we are no longer allies, but we feel like enemies. And so somebody might say, what do I do when this person is being so mean? That's the language of the offended child. But they're just being so mean. Okay, well, let's read. What shall we do? Feed them. Give them a drink. Show them kindness and love to the enemy, much less to the person who's offered you a momentary insult. And so in every way, there's no permission. When we start talking about deep insults, when we're talking about deep hurt feelings, people say, I couldn't help myself, or I think you'll understand why I might have reacted this way. Well, I mean, I do understand because I've gone down the same sinful path, but I do not permit it. Jesus is sympathetic with our weaknesses, but not permissive with them. He doesn't say, well, then go right ahead. Slap them back in the face. Oh, I didn't understand that you were hurt. I wouldn't have written these words if I knew that it actually caused pain. I meant so long as it doesn't really mean anything to you and it doesn't actually hurt, then you be nice back. But if it really hurts, by all means, fire back. No, he means when it really hurts. When the emotions are right here, you got to grab hold of them. And you have to override the hatred with love. But not only that, you have to mean it. And this is a great difficulty. Sometimes we can reach a sort of stoic self-control where even though we feel a swelling volcano inside, we can keep a straight face. And we can play it cool. And then after the interaction is over, somebody might say something. We say, look, I did not say one cross word to him. I maintained control and I didn't say anything offensive. Well, you may not have used offensive words. Let me just tell you, we all know this. When you are ready to strangle someone, the nicest words you say don't come out nice. You can't hide that but so much. And Jesus and John the Baptist make this point to the Jewish leaders time and again in Luke chapter 6 and in verse 45. He says, the good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth what is good, and the evil man out of the evil treasure brings forth what is evil, for his mouth speaks from that which fills his heart. How many times have you thought you walked away having done a good job of keeping yourself under control? If what you mean is you kept a hold on the leash of the rabid dog waiting to get loose, barking the whole time inside, but then toning it down, and I spoke with a measured tone, yet that's not the way it came out. What was in here almost certainly came out here. Because we're not very good at hiding our emotions. We're none of us as good as we think we are. Right? In our minds, we're running it through a filter, and we hear it in the way that we intend it, or the way we intend it to sound. The other person hears it like it's actually coming out. And so they can see the frustration and anger and all of that beneath the surface. How many of you have ever had that conversation with your spouse? What's wrong? Nothing. I'm fine. Clearly. Obviously, you're fine and there's nothing wrong. Now, you know. And that goes both ways. You know. And so you press. And so you say, no, what's wrong? Because you want the honesty. You want to know where things stand. Now, I'm not saying pour it all out and spew it all out and don't have self-control. That's not the idea. The idea is that self-control will not take you but only so far. There's actually got to be some real affection that we build even for insufferable people. For people we don't like, for people who drive us up the wall, there's got to be a shift so that they don't do that. So that that's not the mentality we have towards that person. Ultimately, what we've got to be doing is keeping our eyes trained on the Father. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and in verse 19, 1 Peter 2 and verse 19, he says, "For if this finds favor for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For the sake of conscience toward God." It is not that you develop a way of looking at that person that's better only. It is not, and it's not that what you do is you get to the point where you don't care about that person. See, we're not looking for apathy here. That's not the answer. It's not, do you think I care what you have to say about me? That's not the attitude. The idea is that we want to get to a point where when somebody talks to us, have you ever seen a child who gets hurt in some way? They're insulted or actually physical hurt, and the first thing they do is look up at their parent if they're in the room. Like, what are you going to do about this? Or maybe they're about to engage, they're gonna hit back or whatever, but before they do, this might have been the case in my house a few times growing up. Is Dad here? Because you know that's not going to be acceptable. I think we forget our Father's always there. He's right there. Have you ever had that light bulb moment? I can remember thinking my dad was going on a trip, getting into a fuss and getting pretty sharp with my words I know my dad wouldn't have approved of, and just hearing from his room, the office in his room, "Stephen Douglas," countenance fallen. I didn't know he was there. And if I had known he was there, I would have had the control. Because I did not want his disapproval. For multiple reasons. But truly, I don't want his disapproval. And if we're constantly thinking he's right there, he's watching everything that I say, and not just that, but looking to his example, what would he say in this moment? And you think through the justifications for why we take that offense, for why we let ourselves get so worked up. We take it to the Father, and we tell him of all of our offenses. And here he is the one offended by the whole world and just taking it. And so, keep our focus on him, keep our focus on the Son. What about on the giving end? In giving offense and being offensive, first of all, let me suggest my desire is to give no offense. Over in 1 Corinthians, and we'll be looking at several passages here in 1 Corinthians, because I think that's what a lot of what's going on is there's a whole lot of offensiveness. And these brethren do not care who they offend. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and in verse 32, he says, give no offense either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, so that they may be saved. The idea is that I start from the premise of I don't want to cause offense. Let me just say, there are lots of people right now who start with the premise of hoping to get a rise out of somebody. I've talked with people like that. I know Christians who are like that. You say, why do you do that? I just like to see people get worked up. What is wrong with you? I know what's wrong with them. They're more influenced by the world than by Jesus. And I've been there. And sometimes I go back there, where I'm entertained to see people worked up. I'm entertained to see the reactions. I love to see people get owned or whatever. And I have to pull myself back from that, pull myself back from the constant flame wars and just recognize I cannot be a part of this. I was talking to somebody just the other day about a personality online, and I was just saying, this is not profitable. This man is so incendiary. And he goes, I'm not going to lie, I kind of like it. I just said, you should not. You should stop liking that. It is not healthy for you to enjoy that. And so we need to be careful that we do not enjoy not only the giving of offense, but the enjoyment of watching others give offense. As far as what is offensive, that is the difficulty, isn't it? Some people will say, well, it's always changing. Well, first of all, I understand. I understand at some level you will never keep up with what's offensive. I get that. But also at some level, indeed, what is offensive does change. Like from one place to another and from one time to another. It's not like there is some categorical defined for all time, this is the thing that is offensive. We don't want to use offensive language. But who determines that? Well, culture and time. There are words that are offensive now that were not 100, 200 years ago. There are words that were offensive 200 years ago that are not now. And we have to be reasonable and try to, what it is, we want to understand what is offensive. Paul talks about going through and being in various places with various cultures, you might say. And in beginning of verse 19, he says, though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave to all so that I may win more. To Jews, became as Jews. To those under the law, as under the law. To those who are without law, verse 21, as without law. And then to the weak, I became weak, so that I might win the weak. I become all things to all men, so that I may, by all means, save some. How do you approach that? I try to pay attention, and I try to pick up cues, and I try to adjust my behavior in such a way so that we can be amiable if at all possible. I think in a lot of cases we agree with that. A couple of trips ago when I was in Fiji, we sat down at a study, and after we had studied for a little while, the wife, was sitting closer to the house, and she went in to get some drinks, and she was serving those, and I said, "Thank you so much." And I said, I don't think I caught your name. What is your name?" And then there was silence. And she sort of sheepishly said her name and then went on about her business. Later, Nevitesh said, "Brother, don't ask a man's wife what her name is directly if she has not offered it to you." Okay. Now, I don't feel guilty that I didn't know. That was unintentional. But what if I go to the next study and I walk in the door and I say, "That's ridiculous. How absurd is that? That their wives are so subservient, you can't even carry on a conversation without asking their husband permission. This is the 21st century, people." Let me tell you what, I'm not trying to preach cultural values to them. I'm trying to preach the gospel. And so cultural values don't even come into it. And if I can make that adjustment, I'll make that adjustment. I think we need to be willing to do that even at home. And that we make adjustments, because it's not that, as Paul walks through these various people, it's not like these kinds of people live way over here and these kinds of people live way over. All these people live in Corinth. And so he's got to make those adjustments daily, right? It's not like every other year, for me, maybe I've got to make some cultural adjustments for 3 weeks. No, every day he's got to be making those adjustments so that he can carry on relationships and try to build up people with the gospel, to keep that door open for the sake of the gospel. Now, here's a problem. You can't do that large scale. And social media is large scale. How do you accomplish being all things to all men at the same time? That's not possible. He could not be to the Jews as a Jew while also being to the Gentiles as a Gentile. What he's saying is, when I was approaching and teaching the gospel to the Jews, I adapted and I showed sympathy to that culture, and here I showed sympathy and adapted my behavior to this culture, but you can't do that all at the same time. And so I think sometimes we think that when we march forth onto social media and we forget how broad the audience is. And we say, well, you can't please all the people. Well, that's true. But at least in some sense, Paul says, I'm trying to become all things to all men. Now, I'm not saying that you've got to go stick your head in a book and do all the research and make sure that you never step out of line, that you never potentially offend anyone. Because after all, no matter what you say, it seems somebody will find a way to be offended. He says in chapter 10 of 1 Corinthians, verse 27, if one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone says to you, this meat is sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you and for conscience sake. That is the idea, is that if you know, if you don't know, it's fine. I mean, I'm not, I didn't go home from that fellow's house who I asked his wife's name. I didn't go home from that beating myself up and thinking, oh, I'm so terrible. Why didn't I know about that? Why didn't I think about that? I'm not a terrible person for that. But if I go back after Nebuchadnezzar has told me that this is an offense, and then I boldly walk and say, let me find another wife whose name I can ask, I think Nebuchadnezzar is going to say, brother, it's time to pack your bags. And he'd be right. It's one thing to say, how could I have possibly known that that would be offensive? It's another thing to say, I know this is offensive and I don't care. I don't care because that's stupid. Well, it's stupid to you. It's meaningful to them. You know, on this question, you know, people say we just walk around with muzzles on our mouth. I mean, in some cases, maybe it's not a bad idea. But more importantly, maybe we're just more careful about our audience. You know, if I see something on social media and I think that's funny, but I know a lot of people who wouldn't think that's funny, I just grab hold of that and I send it to the guy that I know think it was funny. And I don't think those things are vulgar or inherently offensive, but I know some people would find them offensive. And so why? Why would I do that? When I know what the cause is going to be, or the result, rather, is going to be. And so I can be more careful. And I can cater my communication. I think people think that sounds like being a politician. I've talked a little bit about taking both sides of issues. Can I suggest to you can take both sides of an issue and keep your integrity? When Paul wrote to Philemon, now we get the case that he's making to Philemon. And the case that he's making to Philemon is free your brother Onesimus. But what case did he make to Onesimus? Go back to your master. Now those two things seem contradictory, don't they? Which one is it? Is it right for Onesimus to go back, or is it right for Philemon to let him go? Paul says yes. Yes, both of those things are right. And in our world, we are so dichotomized, and we cannot harmonize the thinking that would allow Paul to advocate for a slave to go back and for a slave owner to release his slave. It just head explosions. But on an issue as volatile as that, Paul said, I'm going to take both sides. I'm going to take the side of Philemon and tell Onesimus to go back. And I'm going to take the side of Onesimus and tell Philemon to let him go. And I think we can do the same. I think we can be more careful that we don't just side up and take pot shots in the other direction. All of this to say that what I want to do is reserve my offensiveness for when it's necessary. Because there's things that I am willing to say, I don't care who this offends. But that list is really small. How many times have you said that? I'm going to say this and I don't care who it offends. That's just kind of a common vernacular in our American vocabulary. There's one thing that I don't care who it offends, and that is, as Paul says, nothing except Christ and Him crucified. That is what I will say no matter how angry people get or offended people get or triggered or whatever else. But even then, I don't enjoy people getting offended. Like, I don't talk about Christ just to watch people's blood boil. I talk about Him hoping that they might be convinced. Now, I know they might not, and I know they might hate me. But I don't want to be so constantly throwing out offensive things that Jesus Christ is just another one of the offensive things. Rather, what I would like is to show people that I would do anything to go out of my way to be kind and to show you deference. And that highlights the fact this must be important. And I think we make Him of less importance when we choose every hill to die on. Let's choose one hill to die on. That's the hill of Calvary. You just let all the others go. Don't care what they are. I don't care how important they are. Paul had a lot of things important to him, and he said, they're rubbish. What do they mean to me? And so even in the preaching of the gospel, My aim is not to offend, as the Apostle Paul again wrote in Colossians chapter 4. And beginning in verse 5, conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, that you will know how you should respond to each one. I want to give it the best chance possible. The best case. I think Jesus did that. I think as you walk through his ministry, and I hope you've been noticing this in the Gospel of Matthew, as we start out, he's careful in how he lets the information out. He's strategic. And he introduces aspects of who he is along the way. And when someone wants to introduce something too soon, Jesus says, not yet. Now's not the time. Now, all of that doesn't mean that Jesus waits to that moment so that when he reveals it, everybody receives it. There's a time to reveal it, but the time is after the opportunity is there. There are no more excuses. And if you are offended when Jesus reveals himself, it's not because of how he went about it. That's the accusation sometimes when people present the truth. It's not what they said, it's how they said it. Jesus says, I'm going to make sure that's not the case here. I'll say it in a way, and I'll present myself in a way, so that when it's all said and done, there's no excuses. Paul presses down on that as he writes to the Roman Jewish Christians. You had every chance, and you could know. I don't want to get in front of the cross, in other words. I don't want it to become a referendum on me and my attitude. If there's offense, let it be because they're looking right at this. And this is what I'm pointing to. That passage that Andrew read for us in Isaiah chapter 42. As we look at the suffering servant, notice what it says there beginning in verse 2. He will not cry out or raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. Again in verse 4, he will not be disheartened or crushed until he has established justice on the earth. Jesus will take all of the offenses, but he will not cry out and say it's unfair. How dare these people treat me this way? He will not be disheartened. He will not crush. He's just moving forward. He'll absorb it all. And what is his response? Verse 3, a bruised reed he will not break, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. David French had an article a few weeks ago which got me to thinking in terms of this lesson. He said, indeed, if I had to come up with a single sentence to sum up all too much of our current political and cultural combat, it would be this: we are a nation of bruised reeds busy breaking each other. I think that's pretty good. We're all on a hair trigger, and we're all pulling everybody else's trigger. But love and kindness and gentleness is the answer in both directions. We need duller senses in detecting offenses toward us, and love to accept them even when they are meant. We need keener senses in recognizing the offense that we give, and only give offense when we must. Let me suggest this: if you are unwilling to be offended, you will miss out on Christ. Over in Mark chapter 7. In Mark chapter 7, there is a story of Jesus saying offensive things. It is a difficult story to process, frankly. This woman, Syrophoenician woman, she comes to Jesus and she pleads with him. It says in verse 26, a woman was a Gentile of the Syrophoenician race, and she kept asking him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he was saying to her, let the children be satisfied first, for it is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. My goodness, what would we do? Jesus just called this woman a dog. Now, you might say, no, he didn't. Well, I'm going to tell you what. In today's culture, absolutely. Like, can you imagine anybody going, no, that's not exactly what he meant? No. He just said, these are the children, and you are not. Her answer, yes, Lord. But even the dogs under the table feed on the children's crumbs. I believe what Jesus shows in this interaction. I believe, first of all, he knows the woman's heart, and I believe he challenges that woman's heart, but he also allows her to show her heart to a people who are on edge and take offense at Jesus and everything he says and everything he does. And he shows, if I were to put you up on a pedestal and put this woman down here, she would still say, give me whatever you'll give me. What would you do? Preacher treated you like that. Talked to you like that. If you saw the truth, would you say, I'll take it any way I can get it? Or would you say, I will take it, but only if it is served on a platter, just to my liking, exactly at the temperature I want it? Here's a woman says, let it fall to the ground and I'll lick it up. That's humility. And Jesus says, there's the kind of faith that will receive me and my words. Over in Luke chapter 7 and verse 23. Blessed is he who does not take offense at me. Those unwilling to be offended will miss out on Christ. Those who freely give offense will miss out on Christ for different reasons. Where are you this morning? Are you willing to receive the offense, to take hold of the offense of Christ, and to boast in nothing else but the offense of Christ? If that is you, and we can help reconcile you with him in any way, if you would be obedient to the gospel call, won't you respond while we stand and while we sing?